Welcome to Classic Game Room, the oldest, longest-running internet video game review show in the world. CGR started in 1999, that's last millennium, and the majority of Classic Game Room production is supported by backers on Patreon, which is a recurrent monthly crowdfunding service, sort of a subscription model. And one of the greatest things that you can get from backing Classic Game Room on Patreon is the monthly CGR podcast titled CGR 2085. And I'm going to play you a big clip today of July's podcast, which is titled The Sega Dreamcast. It's still thinking of ways to destroy you. Do not mess with the Sega Dreamcast. Or the Vectrex, or Kirby sitting on top of the Vectrex, for that matter. Each month brings a different podcast theme. I've done podcasts on Star Wars, on record collecting, on producing internet videos, on 80s cartoons, and the next one that I'm working on is called the NES. Is it overrated? And after that, I'm putting one together on the Atari 2600 and why collecting for it is so much fun. I like to have guests on the podcasts. They can run from 40 to 60 minutes. I use all high-end professional gear. These take about 2 to 3 days to produce and sound really good, as you're about to hear. In addition to the podcast, backers on Patreon also get the core edited Classic Game Room reviews, ad-free early access, 2 days early, with no ads, and access to the Classic Game Room community on Patreon with the comments field that's fantastic. Were it not for backers on Patreon, Classic Game Room would not be running this year. It's an expensive, time-consuming show to produce. Check the page for details. There's a bunch of tiers, including ringtones, custom artwork, and of course access to the Classic Game Room commenting field on Patreon, which is really nice. So, here is a sample of July's CGR 2085, the Sega Dreamcast. It's still thinking of ways to destroy you. Enjoy. So before I get started though, David, we need to make sure we get some yangling in you for the next one.
Okay, I know, I agree.
Welcome to CGR 2085, the monthly Classic Game Room podcast. This episode is titled The Sega Dreamcast. It's still thinking about ways to destroy you. Where I'll be talking all about the Sega Dreamcast, what makes it great, what makes it fun, what makes it collectible, and what makes it awesome. I've invited some friends along for this podcast, including Dave Crossan from the original Game Room series, 1999 to 2000, and Dave and Joe from GameSack. Even after they made fun of me in their parody video. Plastic Game Room, please. We all know it's Classic Game Room, and it's not made from plastic. That's wood grain. David from the Game Room.
Hello.
What makes the Dreamcast special?
The people who have supported the Dreamcast. And it's the games. Obviously, it's the games. Everybody played the games that when they came out, they were awesome, but people took the games and sort of like held on to them and held on to the system, and it's really kind of developed this afterlife more than any other console, I feel like. You know, because there's all kinds of people releasing homebrew games, doing all kinds of hacks.
Dave is now Lord and Master of a video game con, right?
I'm one of the lords and one of the masters. I definitely am, yes.
So Lord and Master of the a video game con. And what is a video game con, and why should I care?
So a video game con, it's a retro video game con in North Jersey. It's going to be September 10th and 11th this year. It's basically just a really, really cool ass con to go to. There's like 36,000 square feet, console free play, arcade free play. There's going to be lots of Dreamcast, lots of Neo Geos, Sega Genesis. We're actually going to have the Nintendo PlayStation there. We're going to have that prototype there.
Ooh.
Lots of really cool guests. We're going to have guys like Rich from Review Tech USA, Pat the NES Punk, Norman Caruso, the gaming historian, Adam Koralik, the Console War guys, the guys who wrote the complete NES book, Chipocrit, some other music acts, Digital Press Podcast, just tons of guys, tons of stuff.
So basically everybody but me, because I was booked this year.
Exactly. Pretty much.
It's those frustrating real-life responsibilities.
Unfortunately, yes.
They get in the way of the fun things from, well, often, most of the times.
It's such bullshit, isn't it?
It really is. Stay young. Kids, if you're listening, stay young. Don't grow up. Welcome to the show, some very special guests. It's Joe and Dave from GameSack. Hello, Joe and Dave.
Hello. Hi, Mark.
Thank you for joining me in space in the future to talk about the Sega Dreamcast. And before we get started, though, tell listeners what GameSack is, aside from that show that made fun of the way that I apparently say plastic game room.
GameSack is a show on YouTube where we talk about video games and our opinions of them. So just like pretty much every other show, but we try to be good, I think.
But are you angry?
We're not angry. We're not angry reviewers. We don't make any attempt not to be angry. We just be ourselves. We try to have fun with the show.
So you make endless top 10 videos.
we do have a couple of top 10 videos, I guess you could say, but we don't really focus on that. We just talk about certain themes, like, you know, games that push hardware limits. So we pick games on certain consoles that we think show off the console's capabilities really well. And, you know, other stuff like Left in Japan, games that were never brought out in the West, that stayed in Japan. But
so you basically make an endless stream of shitty reaction videos.
There you go.
Hey, you say how you want, Mark, but it's very popular.
This month's podcast is all about the Sega Dreamcast. Do either of you have a Sega Dreamcast?
Hell yes.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I think I have 2 of them, actually, so.
That's good, in case you want to play it more than once.
That's right. You know, you always got to have an insurance system. One that, you know, if one breaks, you're going to have a backup.
Of course, the Dreamcast never breaks.
Well, I thought you just use it to play multiple games at the same time.
Oh, yeah, well, I guess you could do that, but.
When did you get your Dreamcast, David?
Personally, I bought my Dreamcast before it was released in America. I actually bought an import system. I saw it. I was working at Buyback Games at the time, a local game store, and another coworker, I think it was a manager, actually had one, and I was pretty impressed by it. He was just playing Sonic Adventure, and I thought it was pretty cool. And I'm like, man, I really want one of those. So I forked out the extra cash. I don't remember how much extra at the time, but I bought that, and I think it was House of the Dead and Sonic. I played those for a while.
And you guys have been friends for a long time, right? Since high school or something?
Yeah, somewhere around there.
Since the late 80s?
Yeah, acquaintances since the late 80s and friends since.
So presumably, the two of you played Sega Dreamcast back in the day when it was new.
Yep.
Oh, yes. Not only that, but we played the visual memory unit, too.
Absolutely. And that's where most of the fun was on the
right.
Dreamcast console.
What did you play on the VMU?
Anything and everything we could for as long as we could, which was about 15 minutes.
Right. Marathon sessions of raising chows or whatever they are in Sonic Adventure.
The Sega Dreamcast, one of the greatest video game console failures of all time. A game system that nearly sunk Sega. As I understand it, Sega lost money on every single Dreamcast that they sold. And it wasn't until they finally stopped production in 2001 that they started making money again. It's a failure, but why is it that so many of us absolutely love the Dreamcast? It's not the greatest game system ever made. I mean, it's not the Vectrex or anything. It has a pretty lousy controller, even though it did have that sweet VMU card with a screen on it. It's not even the most attractive game system. That honor goes to Sega's own Genesis and or Mega Drive, or the Atari 2600 with a wood grain finish. But the Dreamcast has character, it's cool, and it's super fun to collect for. I'll be talking about that and more during this CGR 2085 podcast, Sega Dreamcast, it's still thinking of ways to destroy you. By the time Sega discontinued the Dreamcast in 2001, they had sold just over 9 million units, at least according to Wikipedia. There's definitely a lot of Dreamcasts out there, which keeps the costs relatively low. It's not a rare game system. Also, according to Wikipedia, there were more than 600 games released for the Sega Dreamcast, so despite its short lifespan, a lot of games were made for it, and they're still making new ones to this day. Why do I like the Dreamcast so much because it's called the frickin' Dreamcast. It casts dreams, and my dream is playing great games while driving an El Camino rocking out the Truxton. It does all that, or at least 2 out of 3. The Sega Dreamcast has personality. The Sega Dreamcast has an incredible game library. The Sega Dreamcast is reasonably affordable to collect for. The Sega Dreamcast is still fun to play, to this day, well into the future. And I'm always reminded that it's the future, because every time I turn it on I need to reset the clock, and I'm reminded how many years it's been since that fateful day of 9/9/99, when the Dreamcast was released to the US. Joe, when did you get a Dreamcast?
I got it at launch, so that's 9/9/99 for $199.99. And waited in line because they had a midnight launch, and I got in line, I don't know how much earlier than midnight, but my receipt says I picked it up at like 1:30, I think, in the morning. So I was in line for at least an hour and a half before I even got mine.
What was it?
EB, Electronics Boutique, down Southwest Plaza.
Yeah.
And then I picked up, along with it, Sonic Adventure, of course, because everyone had to have that. Soul Calibur. And I might have picked up something else, but one game I know I picked up and I returned right away was NFL Blitz or something like, or NFL 2K. I was like, oh, I'll need a football game. And I got home and played it. I was like, nah, I guess I don't need it. And I returned it the next day. The receipt says I returned it. So that's how I knew I did that. I don't remember anything about the game.
I think we actually played that one back in the day, and I don't remember much about it either. I believe that's the one that I watched Dave in the original Game Room series. We tried to play it online, and it was just a dreadful disaster. It would not play online.
Yeah.
It was too early.
Another interesting thing about the Dreamcast is that it was really the first one to come packaged, able to go online, like right out of the box. And I didn't do that a whole lot with the modem. I eventually got the broadband adapter, and it was so much better with that. But unfortunately, not enough games supported that.
Well, let me ask you guys the big question here. GameSack. What makes the Sega Dreamcast so special?
Well, it's not the controller, that's for sure.
It definitely is not the controller.
Well, when you say special, what kind of special do you mean?
Well,
that might be the controller.
It has a fond place in so many people's hearts. When you say Dreamcast, people who like the Dreamcast love the Dreamcast. Why? Yeah. What makes it unique?
Well, I think they were just really trying really hard with those games. A lot of those games, and they, like I said before, a lot of them were very ahead of their time. And there's just a very unique feel to a lot of those games that they weren't there when, the PlayStation 2 rolled around, really. Because, I don't know, it's hard to say, because the Dreamcast was kind of like an in-between generation console. It came out between the PS1 and PS2, that kind of era. Right. So it just had that kind of unique feel.
It had the VMU.
Yeah, it felt to me more like an arcade type machine, because the games really felt arcadey. I mean, like the ones I mentioned, Confidential Mission, Hydro Thunder, of course, was an arcade game to begin with, but House of the Dead 2, they're just awesome games. I mean, stuff you'd find in the arcade.
You know what else makes it special is that is by Sega. They made it really easy to program for, unlike the Saturn before it. So yes. So a lot of people were doing better stuff with it. So the games, right, I think, were just of generally a higher quality than third-party games were back on the Saturn.
It may surprise you to learn that I didn't buy a Sega Dreamcast on launch day. I didn't get one until 2000. This time of my life was pretty exciting. I was in film school at the time. It was the original run of The Game Room with me and Dave, where Dave actually introduced me to the Sega Dreamcast because he bought one on launch day. So I was always in awe of his and games like Hydro Thunder and Soul Calibur. But I was also a huge PlayStation fan and tended to spend my money on PlayStation games, and Gran Turismo 2 sucked up a good portion of my life at this time. But eventually 2000 came around, and I finally bought a Sega Dreamcast. They really weren't all that expensive. I don't remember how much it was. But I bought Sega Rally 2, and I can't remember what the other game was. Maybe some of you who remember those old episodes better than I do can tell me. Classic Game Room, or The Game Room at the time, was the first internet video game review show, as you know, and we were certainly the first one to cover the Sega Dreamcast, and all of the Dreamcast games got big hits. So we were part of a bigger company at the time and had this tiny budget and spent most of it buying and then selling Sega Dreamcast games to review, because that's what people really wanted to see. Games like Dead or Alive 2 and Echo the Dolphin, Tokyo Extreme Racer. We had a lot of fun with these games. And Dave and I played a lot of Sega Dreamcast, and I remember going over to his place where he had his hooked up online. Every now and then we would try to play something like Choo Choo Rocket or whatever the football game was, NFL 2K, on the internet, and it was just awful. It totally didn't work. The Dreamcast was way ahead of its time, and that's another one of its cool features. I think Sega designed it really well, but since Sega wasn't Sony, they really just couldn't hang in there. Some other games we reviewed at the time: Marvel vs. Capcom 1 and 2, Carrier, Resident Evil, Code Veronica. That was a good review. Sega GT was incredible. We did the NHL game, Virtua Striker. I think we did Virtua Tennis. What's amazing is that indie companies are still putting out good games for the Dreamcast today, like Gunlord and Fast Striker, that look really good. And back in 2000, the Dreamcast looked really good, and it just crushed the PlayStation. And the N64 wasn't even a contender. People got upset about our Perfect Dark review. You know why we really didn't like Perfect Dark all that much? Why we weren't impressed? Because we were playing Sega Dreamcast at the time. And admittedly, Perfect Dark isn't as bad as we said it was, but the N64 could not go toe-to-toe technically against the Dreamcast. I believe the first two Dreamcast games that we reviewed, because you bought the game system on what date?
9/9/99.
And we used your Sega Dreamcast for the majority of, certainly the early Sega Dreamcast reviews before I bought one in 2000. But the first two Dreamcast games that I remember reviewing were yours. They were Hydro Thunder and Soul Calibur, right?
I was going to say Soul Calibur had to be one of them. But yeah, Hydro Thunder definitely sticks out to me as one of the absolute best games on that system. And I don't know if it's just because, you know, those were like the two games that I had at first and I just cherished them. But I mean, you play Hydro Thunder to this day and Soul Calibur to this day, and they're fucking great games.
There was a clip. To hear the full 50-plus minute podcast and get new podcasts every month, back Classic Game Room on Patreon at Podcaster, Warrior, Level, or higher. Read the page for details. Thank you again. See you soon.